Critical thinking and how to argue. How important are those? I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. Today we're joined by Dr. Catherine Hundleby. Our discussion will revolve around critical thinking, argumentation, and some research of hers. But before that, Catherine, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work you do.
Hi, my name is Catherine Hundleby, and I am an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Windsor. My training is in philosophy, but I also do feminist research, and I work on theories of knowledge and theories of argumentation. Now, argumentation is quite a mouthful, and it often is a notion that confuses people, but it involves all kinds of processes of argument and arguing. That doesn't just mean fighting. It can also mean a constructive sharing of reasons.
Yeah, and that's a very good distinction to make because argumentation, it does have that connotation. When someone first hears it, they might jump to that conclusion, fighting, combative, things like that. So it's good we make that clear from the start. I want to begin with touching on the concept of critical thinking. What does it mean to be a critical thinker?
What does it mean to be a critical thinker? That is a big question. And there have been a lot of different answers to it. If we're thinking of critical thinking as a quality of a person, it could be a set of skills or a practice. And that practice or set of skills could consist in a number of different things. It might just involve learning a form of analysis. That's what a lot of people think about when they believe that education provides critical thinking. They say, education teaches you how to use mathematics, and that's a form of analysis. But not everybody thinks that any skill qualifies as critical thinking, that any form of thinking qualifies as critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Many people popularly, when they want critical thinking, and when they say critical thinking is important, mean that problem-solving skills are important. That when you are in a situation and you need to come up with an answer, there are skills you can have that help you come up with answers. And that's critical thinking. So that's what's often meant by critical thinking in business.
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about critical thinking in the context of philosophy, with regard to the theory of knowledge or epistemology, we tend to mean metacognition.
Oh, fancy word.
Yeah. So metacognition is really cognition about cognition, or thinking about thinking. So learning to reflect on your own thinking processes and on other people's thinking processes to see which ones work and which ones don't.
Yes, and critical thinking seems to be something you have to strive to hone, especially in today's day and age. We have a lot of things going on social media, like fake news. How important is it for you to think for yourself and not just believe everything you see?
Oh, it's so important. Yeah, it's so important. I do think critical thinking is increasingly important because with the internet, we've had an explosion of information and ways for people to publish stuff. And even before the age of fake news, I remember a librarian telling me about the advice that they give to students. And the advice was, if you find something on the internet, it's no better than finding a piece of paper lying on the ground. You need to know where it came from.
Correct.
And we are still in this situation, but multiplied so much more over because the communication on the internet has become so complicated that new skills are needed to discern better and worse sources.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, where the news comes from. I agree, it's wholly important and super critical to actually realizing what you're reading, whether or not it's fake or it's true. In today's day and age, though, it seems like all you really need to be listened to and heard by a mass group of people is a blue check mark beside your name on Twitter. People, especially younger people, tend to just follow celebrities, get their news from something like BuzzFeed, where it's a short headline and they don't really dive into the details of the article. They don't get these sources. You think that's a big problem that has to change?
That's a hard one for me because that's sort of a question of educational psychology and how people learn skills. And I think we're still waiting to see what the long-term effects are going to be. We anticipate problems from celebrity culture and from this kind of, I don't know what to call it. It's a boom in, that was like a boom in international gossip.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair way to say it.
And it's easy to get caught up in gossip. And we have the problem of clickbait, right? And when clickbait dominates our sources of information, because it's fun, right? I get caught up by clickbait headlines too.
Mhm.
That when we're taking in a lot of information that way, it almost takes up space in our head that could be better used for other sources.
100%. And you mentioned something about education there. I've heard the proposition the university should prioritize teaching all of their students to be critical thinkers. Do you think that currently they do a good job of that? And if not, should that be a goal they strive for? Because currently you register for a degree and you learn a lot of the course content, but you don't necessarily learn how to think for yourself.
Right. And that autonomy, that independence of thought is part of the reason that we value critical thinking, right? In any of the three definitions, whether you're learning a form of analysis, whether it's something more sophisticated like problem solving or metacognition, in all of those forms, you gain independence. And that's really important. This is a huge question, and there is actually a fair bit of research about it. I'm not as up on it as I would like to be. I hope to spend some time in my next sabbatical learning more about this. But there are a number of critical thinking tests that have been used to measure what students learn over the course of their university careers. And there's evidence pointing in different directions. Mm-hmm. There's lots of evidence that students learn critical thinking, though, in university of these different forms. There is evidence, and I do believe that students do learn critical thinking, but it's a long process. Learning to be a critical thinker in any of these ways, learning any of these processes of independent thought takes practice. And one learns it a little bit in lots of courses, and one can also learn it in a very focused and concentrated way in specific courses on critical thinking or reasoning skills or argumentation. And these can sort of give you a boost, but it still takes a commitment to lifelong learning and lifelong improvement in one's own critical thinking skills, I think.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And let's say that you gain experience for critical thinking by doing things like engaging in debates and sharing your ideas. A lot of people are criticizing universities for being a little bit too politically correct these days. And what I mean by that is that certain ideas are completely taboo. Even thinking them is not allowed. And it limits discussion to a certain sphere where people who have differing ideas for good or bad reasons are not able to express those. And does that hinder the ability to cultivate the skill set of critical thinking?
No, I don't think so. I think it's actually I think it's a false panic.
Yeah.
And I mean, as a philosopher, philosophy classrooms are a little bit different than other types of classrooms, and I am quite open to all kinds of challenges, including when people say, why should I care what Plato said? I can answer that question, and I can answer other questions too, and I'm open to all sorts of challenges, but I'm not open to ignorance. And I don't have time for students who haven't done their reading, and I don't have, and I don't make space for opinions that are ill-informed. So I think some of the stuff that's not being that's experiencing exclusion, some of the viewpoints that say they're excluded from the university are viewpoints that are actually not informed viewpoints. Yes. Not based on evidence, but based on hypothesis, based on, what's the word I'm looking for? Conspiracy theories, even. Mm-hmm. And so, the academy is very importantly a place for open debate, but it's not a free-for-all. We have rules, and we hold people to them. And I will shut down somebody if they bring in false information. That's true. And the academy has always been that way. There's nothing new about that.
Yes. What if it's not false information per se, though, and it's just controversial? And from the sake of the person who are saying these controversial things, if the goal really is critical thinking and to help them achieve that form of enlightenment, to get them thinking, isn't the proper approach to combat their ideas faithfully instead of shutting them down and not even addressing them in the first place?
Ah, well, there are different issues here. A lot depends on who this person is. If we're
Yeah.
talking about students, I think we do have an opportunity to help students grow in their understanding and to engage them and develop their capacities. But we also have an obligation to indicate when we think they're using false information and point out to them why. It is not our job to provide them, however, with therapy if they have hateful attitudes towards other people.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that they need to pursue on their own.
Yeah, and this leads me to my next question, actually. How to teach, or instead of teach, how to better enable someone to cultivate the skill set of critical thinking? To me, it's very different than teaching someone to think like you. And maybe that's a distinction that's not very clear to all instructors. I know on your blog you have some resources to help professors understand the difference between that. And it may be a trap for certain people who find themselves in a situation like that. Instead of explaining the toolkit they use to reach their conclusions, there is a temptation to just want to distribute the conclusions themselves. Do you think that's an issue?
Let me make sure I understand this. There's a temptation for professors to just want to distribute their opinions instead of helping students draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, and maybe not even just professors, teachers at the high school level.
Sure.
There's like a certain toolkit that they use to arrive at their conclusions, such as these frameworks you've talked about.
Yeah.
And maybe as a shortcut or because they just want to, whatever reasons they have, instead of teaching the toolkit, what they end up doing is providing answers straight away to students.
Yeah. I think there is a big temptation to do that because trying to meet students where they live and help them rethink their thinking, to do that metacognition is a lot of work. It demands an incredible amount of creativity from an instructor. And so one can be tempted to resist that. It is easier to lecture than to engage in a constructive conversation with a class.
Yeah.
It's also hard to do in large groups. And the underfunding of education in Canada and in other places, and I want to say especially Ontario, has the lowest post-secondary funding in Canada. The underfunding of education and post-secondary education, but also high school, and I can't really speak so much about the earlier levels, but I believe that they have been defunded for decades. And this makes it much harder to teach critical thinking because it does require fostering that independence and listening really hard to the individual and working with them as individuals.
Yeah, that's correct. And arguing is another component that's tied to critical thinking. You can even say argumentation is almost like a form of art. In the context of today's politics, which are seemingly becoming more and more polarized, what types of argumentation do you see being used commonly? Maybe you can point out some common fallacies as well that go along with that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think we have increasingly on the internet a tendency for people to engage in what scholars of argument call heuristic argument. That's ERISTIC, heuristic. Mm-hmm. And it means basically an argument that's a fight, and the goal is to win. People seem to be, Adam, people have always fought for fun, and they've used arguing as a substitute for physical battles. And that's a good thing about argument, that it can allow us to sort out conflicts without physically hurting each other.
Yeah.
But we can get very caught up in the sport of argument as a vicious sort of sport in which the idea is to try to destroy the other person and to not give any quarter. And we have all kinds of metaphors that go with this. Metaphors of war, argument is battle. where you pierce somebody's ideas, you throw down, you back them into a corner, and so on. We have lots of metaphors this way. And sometimes argument does work that way, and it has certain functions. But I think we've got too much caught up in exchanging reasons only to try to put other people down, or only to try to shut other people's ideas down.
Yes, I agree 100%. And it's also interesting because when your goal in an argument is to defeat the other person, it's a mistake in my opinion, because it takes the real goal, which should be to learn and better form your opinions, and it makes it secondary to vanquishing your opponent. So you may be tempted to restructure your idea in a way that's not honest to get a one-up over your opponent. It may tempt you to harden your beliefs because you don't want to admit you're wrong. The real goal should just be to get a better understanding of the topic and better your own thinking. So how do we do that shift? And it begs the question too, is there an ideal way to argue?
Well, your view is very similar to what philosopher Dan Cohen says, and I think Cohen's really captures something really important and valuable about argument, the way it helps us learn about things. We learn to criticize ourselves, we gain information from other people, we develop better understanding of the topic. And I don't think there is an ideal way to argue, except perhaps, because arguing can serve lots of different purposes. Sometimes, including, I'm sympathetic to a rather unusual view by philosopher Douglas Walton, that even a quarrel, even a vicious, emotional, irrational fight between people can serve a purpose. It can serve a purpose of allowing people to vent their emotions. It may serve some other purposes too. Sometimes we do want to hurt people. I'm not sure that's a good purpose. I don't think it's one I want to support.
Yeah.
But emotions is good, right? And sometimes we need to have it out. So even that sort of bad form of argument, I think, can serve some valuable purposes. But I think we can get too carried away and too attracted by the emotional argument, that is the emotionally heightened argument, when there's a lot to be gained from the calm argument, the reflective argument, the argument that involves a lot of listening. In the quarrel, there's not a lot of listening, but in arguments where we learn, there has to be a lot of listening. And I think most of the most valuable arguments involve a lot of listening.
Yeah, I agree. And just one point before we move on, I found it interesting, this concept of the calm argument. I'm tying it back to social media. The calm argument doesn't typically get a lot of likes and retweets. So maybe there's an incentive to be overly emotional and exaggerate certain things to rile people up. And you can give your thought on that, but I also want to pose a second question. I want to move on to your research now. You have a paper published called The Authority of the Fallacies Approach to Argument Evaluation. My first question is, can you highlight what the fallacy approach is? And I think we touched on it a little bit before.
Sure. So the first question had to do with the calm argument and the internet.
Yeah, internet points for being overly emotional.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think even though we get to sit back on our computers and we have opportunities to reflect on what people say, I think we often don't. My own pet theory is that it's the anonymity of the internet that encourages us just to lash out, instead of taking time to listen and ask people questions instead of just responding.
Yes, 100%. Because without the anonymity, if you're face to face as a person, it kind of humanizes the conversation a little bit. You're talking to another person, but behind a screen, you don't really have that. Yeah, and my second question is, moving on to your research, you have this topic, the fallacies approach to argument evaluation. Can you explain a little bit about that? Because I feel like we did touch on it a little bit, but just to directly define.
There's a lot to say about that. The concept of fallacies goes back very far in Western history. It goes back to the philosopher Aristotle in ancient Greece, and certain sorts of reasoning that he identified as problematic, that he called sophistical. And so from there, we get things like the ad hominem argument, the appeal to the person. And I think begging the question comes from Aristotle too. It's also known as arguing in a circle.
Hmm.
Later on, like almost 2 centuries, almost 2 millennia later, we have John Locke, and he brings in some different sorts of ideas. He's concerned with appeals to authority and how we defer to authority. This he called ad verecundium, and we continue to be concerned when we're teaching argument and critical thinking about the inappropriate appeal to authority, just as we are with ad hominem arguments or begging the question. So there's this history, and they're quite varied, but the accounts of fallacies these days, of these errors in reasoning that philosophers identified, these days tend to be formulated in terms of arguments and understood as problems in arguing, when people employ reasons in ways that are unjustified and don't provide for good arguments. But they nonetheless provide arguments that people can be sucked in by.
Hmm.
So sometimes in textbooks in fact, most textbooks in critical thinking, this is what my research indicated, treat fallacies as if they were all wrong, as if it were never correct to appeal to a person's personal characteristics when deciding whether to accept their reasons. But sometimes it is. For instance, when a politician promises something and you know them to have a bad history of breaking their promises, then that politician should not be trusted. And this is a good argument. It's not a bad argument. It's an appropriate use of the consideration of a person's characteristics and history in assessing the value of their reasoning.
And that's very interesting, because my first thought when hearing about the fallacies was that the problem was basing your entire decision on just the fallacy. But given that context, if you use the fallacies in combination with other things like context and maybe some facts and some data, a track history of him lying, would that negate the term fallacy and just add this use of identifying a pattern as a more concrete rationale for coming to your conclusion?
Well, these patterns in argument that have been identified with fallacies are now being called argumentation schemes by scholars. And they can be construed in completely positive terms, and you can say that fallacies are just instances of not upholding the adequate standard for that type of reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm very sympathetic to that sort of view. However, I do nonetheless think that fallacies are very useful educationally. I think that's their primary value.
Do you mean by that, like, it presents an opportunity to learn from your own mistakes, or?
Yeah, and to be able to observe. Most people will never have the opportunity for an in-depth study of arguing and argument standards. And so most people won't be able to learn and gain practice with very detailed techniques of scrutinizing the reasoning that people offer and one's own reasoning. One of the things that's good about fallacies is they are catchy.
Yeah.
They are catchy. And they are supposed to represent common patterns of error in the way people in our culture reason. I'm not sure that the textbooks are always good about this, and some of the patterns that they focus on are really not so common anymore. Mm-hmm. But if they do represent common patterns, then I think the fallacy analysis provides a powerful way for us to help people identify these common patterns of reasoning and common ways in which people go wrong with them.
Yes, and speaking of common patterns, what do you think in today's world the most common fallacy is? What do you see people falling into most often?
Oh,
For me, I might say confirmation bias. A lot of people just see something on Twitter or Facebook or Reddit that it can just be a snippet, a headline, and it confirms what they already think. They don't even want to look a little bit deeper into it. They stop caring about the other side, and it hardens their belief, not really based on fact. Just it can be anything they see that can confirm their thought. And I think because of something like social media and the internet, it's become readily available. What do you
Yeah.
think? What would you say is the most common?
I think your pick is good. I think that that confirmation bias is a huge problem that way. Or I'm not sure if what you actually described is actually confirmation bias, or whether that would be better described as hasty conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because I hear my students say now in a way I never used to hear them say, but I read X, right? And it's like, well, just because you read it, right? You could probably read not X also, and somewhere, right? For anything you can find on the internet, you can probably find somebody else saying the opposite.
Yeah, and I've often heard that the best way to actually form an opinion is to start off by searching for points contradictory to the stance you already hold. And if your stance still holds after being exposed to all that contradiction, or if you don't find any contradiction, then you're good. But it seems like the more common approach is to Google things that will immediately confirm what you already think. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And it's that strategy of seeking out the contrary information is both an old technique of teaching critical thinking and argument, and also one that recent social science research and education research has indicated is quite effective in teaching you to improve your own reasons, and as a strategy for improving your own reasons.
And now I kind of want to move on to asking you about your current research. Where is it taking you, and what are you working on nowadays, if you can share?
Well, actually, I'm coming back. Not right now. I'm finishing up some older projects, but I'm hoping next summer to come back to research on fallacies and critical thinking. But what I've been working on lately has been anger in argument.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it is, because it's an interesting one, because of all the emotions, anger is one that we associate strongly with argument, especially in English, where the word argument tends to be, has this connotation of a verbal fight. It's not so much the case in other Indo-European languages, but especially because it is in English, we have this strong association with anger too. And anger can be very destructive to the exchange of reasons in argument. But if we can take this calm approach, if you like, if we can try to calm ourselves in the face of anger, we can learn a lot of things from anger. And in fact, arguing can help us make sense of our anger by giving us a way to reason through our anger, figure out why we're angry, what we are responding to, what sort of remedies are possible, and so on. So I think as a social process, arguing can help us with anger, and anger can be a valuable part of it. But that's only a possibility. It still, of course, is very often a huge problem.
Yeah, and I'm kind of glad you brought that up, because it seems very applicable. I keep saying it in today's day and age. Anger keeps coming up. So the study of that would be very interesting. And before we close, I just want to ask, you have any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
Keep working on your thinking.
The golden rule.
Yes, my golden rule.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. That was a great episode. And to the audience, we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Marco.